I would like to turn over the festivities to Kelsey Davenport, our Director for Nonproliferation Policy, who's been leading the way for us on not just the North Korea denuclearization and peace issue, but on the Iran nuclear deal issue. But today the focus is going to be on North Korea with our other guests. Kelsey.
Great. Thank you, Daryl, and thanks to all of you for coming today. We're now going to turn the conversation to North Korea and the looming question of what comes next in the negotiations between Pyongyang and Washington. And I'm thrilled today to have an expert panel to discuss this. We have Suzanne DiMaggio. She is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. There's more of her bio in your program, but I would just note for the purpose of this panel that she also directs a dialogue between the United States and North Korea. We're also very lucky to have Frank Aum with us. Frank is a senior expert of North Korea at the United States Institute of Peace. And prior to that, he was a senior advisor for North Korea in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So it's been a very eventful month of North Korea policy. We saw Kim Jong-un and President Trump meet in Hanoi for a summit that ended abruptly. And it's still not entirely clear what happened during that meeting. But coming out, there was no plan for negotiations to continue. And we do know that there was some disagreement over how talks on denuclearization in particular should continue. President Trump said he wants a big deal, that he urged Kim Jong-un to go all in, and Kim was not ready to do that, and that's why the talks stopped. And on the other hand, we saw Kim Jong-un say that they put an offer on the table, dismantlement of facilities at Yongbyon in exchange for relief from sectoral sanctions imposed by the UN, but the US wanted more, and that wasn't acceptable to them. So the state of negotiations is quite unclear. Last week, President Moon from South Korea came to Washington to meet with Trump. And we also saw some developments in North Korea. The Supreme People's Assembly met, and we heard Kim Jong-un talking about negotiations again, really for the first time since the Hanoi summit. There had been some radio silence in North Korea regarding the process going forward. So that's really where I want to start today's discussions, and looking at these developments last week and what they mean for the future of talks going forward. So Suzanne, perhaps I could start with you, and you could just give us your impression of the Moon visit, the developments in North Korea, and what you think that might signal for the prospects of negotiations moving forward.
Thanks so much, Kelsey. First, let me thank the Arms Control Association for having me here today. I especially would like to thank Daryl, Kelsey, and Kingston for their leadership on this broad range of important issues. In my home, there are only a few publications now that we actually get hard copies of. We read everything digitally, but the Arms Control Association monthly book is one, and it's the only one my husband and I fight over who gets to read it first. And he's a musician, so you're doing something right.
And I will just say that I didn't ask her to say that.
No.
That was completely spontaneous.
So, and it's a true story. I'm not making that up. So what comes next? I think, like Admiral Mullen said before, I'd like to join him in noting that President Trump's, we can call it unorthodox personal diplomacy with Kim Jong-un is a welcome development. I would call it a breakthrough. I think it's the right approach given the personalities that are involved, namely his and Kim Jong-un's. The leader-to-leader approach hasn't been tried this way, and I think in this particular setting, it is the right one. And it's brought about a dramatic reduction in tensions. If you remember, just late 2017, we were on the verge of fire and fury. And I think what many of us thought then and still believe brought us very close to a potential military conflict. But I think that the limits of this approach are becoming clearer, particularly after Hanoi. This breakthrough is only going to get us so far. The summit tiering, I think, is only going to get us far. And it's clear now we need a coherent strategy in order to move forward. A coherent strategy and pragmatic goals. So those were the two things that I would stress in order to make lasting progress. And even though the tensions have been reduced, the fact remains that North Korea's program is more advanced today than it was 2 summits ago. That is a fact. Both sides, in order to get to this point of progress, I think both sides have been making mistakes and need to make some adjustments in order to move forward. Let me start with the North Koreans. I think that they need to change up their approach. Madam Che, one of the leading negotiators on the North Korean side, Chae Son-wi, said after the summit that the full blame for the impasse should be placed on Bolton and Pompeo. And she called the chemistry between Trump and Kim mysteriously wonderful. So that's a good sign. They want to keep the door open to the leader-to-leader approach. But what I would say to her is that their lack of interest in meeting with anyone but the president is understandable. But how is it working for you? It's not really working, is it? And I think that's why it needs to be changed. And with President Trump, I think the North Koreans need to understand that they're facing challenges that maybe they haven't faced before interacting with U.S. officials. The first, I think, we have to be frank, is he has a limited knowledge of these issues. He doesn't understand the details, the complexities. Few would, actually, or the history and the context. So the notion of him being able to negotiate these very complex set of issues at the table, I think is unrealistic. The second is he's easily distracted. So while they were in Hanoi, what was happening here in Washington? Michael Cohen was testifying, and it was clear he spent probably most of the night before the meeting watching television and the hearings. And then I would also add he is a bit undisciplined. I don't think anyone would argue with me on that. And Madam Che herself, in her statement, called attention to the fact, she said that it was their understanding that the U.S. did not ready itself, she said, to sit face to face with us. So I think it makes these points taken together, I think it would be in North Korea's interest to stop playing so hard to get. Sit down with American negotiators and work things out before the summit happens. In Steve Biegun, the U.S. representative to North Korea, he's a very able, agile, smart interlocutor, and instead of giving him the runaround, let's be frank, they should be meeting regularly in Pyongyang, other capitals, to get the work done that needs to happen before the two leaders meet. Before the next, there's a lot of talk now about a third summit, and that seems to be all the emphasis is organizing a third summit. And I think we need to gain much needed traction at the working level before we even think about another summit. So that would be my message to the North Koreans if they're watching. The U.S. also made some critical mistakes. I think before this summit, we heard a very comprehensive address by Steve Biegun at Stanford. And in my estimation, this was the first time I've heard even what I would call the outline of a U.S. strategy towards North Korea. It still wasn't perfect. There were still a lot of gaps. But I think it at least showed a way forward that was, as I said before, clear, comprehensive, but also had pragmatic goals. But what happened in Manila, it's somehow the script was changed when they got to the table. And what we've now learned is that at the last minute, President Trump handed Kim Jong-un a piece of paper that said, we are going for a big deal. As Kelsey said, not only we want your full nuclear program, we want your missile capabilities, your biological and chemical weapons, and a full inventory of your program now. And that was completely unrealistic. In the North Koreans' mind, as I've had many conversations with them about this, they see this as the Libya model. It is unacceptable to them. And I just want to make this point, that the leader-to-leader approach, I fully endorse it, One of the things I like about it is that it really, President Trump's instinct that in order to make progress, we have to change the fundamental nature of the relationship between Pyongyang and Washington. And in that way, I think we have to recognize, and the administration needs to recognize, that Kim Jong-un is not going to make any significant moves to reduce or rein in his program unless and until he feels his regime is safe and that he sees there's a clear path towards economic modernization ahead. And we're so far from that right now. The good news is that the items left at the table in Hanoi, I think, are the makings of a very good interim deal. And I should say there's a clear middle way between what the North Koreans said they wanted in Hanoi and what the US said they wanted. And that middle way is to reach agreement on the overarching goal. For the US, of course, this would be denuclearization, but also manage to put forward a path of interim agreements in order to get there. What is the way forward? This is the work of diplomacy that needs to be done. And as I said, these items were left on the table. Kelsey mentioned a couple of them. I would call this a very strong interim deal as a first step. One is the fact that the North Koreans offered to permanently end testing of their nuclear program and their missile program and codify it, I think was a very good offer that we probably should have accepted. I think it's significant. And I think the next step for the US is to follow up on this and insist that this include inspectors on the ground to codify that indeed testing has been suspended. I think the offer on Yongbyon was also significant. Yongbyon is a very big facility. They produce their plutonium and tritium there. It's also their main centrifuge facility. And I think the fact that they put this on the table and offered to open it up to UN experts and inspectors was also quite significant. I think a very important step for us to get going right away is to get inspectors back on the ground ASAP. As we saw during the framework agreement, when we had inspectors on the ground, the North Koreans' program did not advance. That's a fact, and we need to get back there. And the third thing that was on the table was opening a liaison office in Pyongyang. I also think this is something, this is not a concession. This is something that would really give us on-the-ground access to North Korean officials 24/7. Can you imagine that job? But I think it's important that we move forward there. So the two things I would emphasize just to conclude are we need to get clear channels of communication up and running. And we also need a clear, sustained diplomatic process as a priority. And in exchange, I should say, I didn't bring this up, but I should have, is the issue of sanctions. I really believe that we have to get to the place where a limited reduction of sanctions has to be part of this package, and it has to happen, part of it has to happen early. In particular, what the North Koreans seem to be interested in especially is things that would move the inter-Korean economic projects, joint economic projects forward. Things like the Kaesong industrial complex and some joint tourism projects. We should not look at this as a concession either. This is what sanctions are meant to do. You slap them on a country that's not behaving well to get them to change their behavior. They're not punitive measures. So this is what sanctions are meant to do. So we should move forward on that carefully with our eyes open and in a limited way. And finally, let me just say, the path I've put forward, I know, probably could take years. But we have to get to the place where we're meeting with North Koreans on a regular basis, not just during the pageantry of summits. My fear is that we're now stuck in a cycle of summits where there are just limited bursts of diplomacy in between. And if that is the way we're going to do this, I think maybe the reduction in tensions will continue, but we will not make any progress on all of these other goals. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Suzanne. There's a lot of threads there that I hope we can pick up on in the conversation. But before that, I'd like to turn to you, Frank, and if you could give us your impressions from the meetings last week with Moon, the meetings in North Korea, and where you think we stand moving forwards, and anything you'd like to add about what the process should look like.
Sure. So again, thank you, Kelsey and Daryl, for having me. It's a privilege to be here, and also a privilege to be with Suzanne. I feel like every time I read one of her op-eds or listen on the radio, I'm always in strong agreement. I find myself nodding, so it's good to be here with Suzanne. So I think Suzanne was very comprehensive, so I don't want to add too much more because there's probably other interesting questions. But in general, I would say from the Trump-Moon summit last week, as well as the North Korean Supreme People's Assembly last week as well, two very important events, I'm not sure if I heard anything new. I think I basically heard both sides doubling down. So we had President Trump reaffirming that he wants a big comprehensive deal. He wants to maintain sanctions until North Korea denuclearizes. He seemed to express some flexibility on accepting a smaller deal, but this is all sort of dependent on what kind of deal is it. He needs to see it, and so it has to be a good deal for the U.S. And it's hard for me to think of North Korea offering some good deal for the U.S. that's smaller. So I just don't think that's very likely. On the North Korean side, they said the same thing too. They don't want to be a part of a process where they're taking unilateral actions, where the U.S. continues this hostile policy. But at the same time, both sides expressed a willingness to engage in a third summit. So that's the positive, right? I think the negative is that for both sides to really get there, I think there's probably a better understanding that they need to have far greater assurance of some sort of, if not final, near final outcome that can be basically signed off by the heads of state at the summit. So a lot more preparation than happened before Hanoi. I think both leaders overestimated their ability to persuade the other. I think Kim Jong-un thought he'd go in, meet with Trump directly, take advantage of Trump's excitedness about trying to achieve this great deal, and he thought he could basically get Trump to give away the store and provide huge relief on sectoral sanctions that have been hampering North Korea's economy. Likewise, I think President Trump met with Kim Jong-un, and he thought if he does so directly, he can use his great negotiating abilities to get North Korea to give up its entire program, go big, and even give up its WMD. So both sides were wrong, obviously, but again, as Suzanne outlined, there were a lot of agreements that were or a lot of progress that were made on some of the issues like the exchange of liaison offices, end of war declaration, economic humanitarian assistance, the continuation of remains recovery operations. So that all can serve as a foundation for the next summit. I think the concern is that time is running out, and if there is a third summit, that is pretty much the last shot, I think, because after that, I think both sides will kind of retreat to their corners, and North Korea will play the waiting game, waiting for the elections.
Good point. So coming back to this question of time running out, reportedly Kim Jong-un said last week that he's going to give President Trump a year to sort of become more flexible. So Frank, what was your kind of interpretation of that statement? Was that rhetoric designed at a domestic audience? Was that a message to Trump? And then what do you think he's really looking for when he says more flexibility? Well,
like I said, again, there's only less than 2 years left in President Trump's administration, and so I think Kim Jong-un is basically signaling that, by the time it gets to next year, that's not enough time to really reach a deal and then take any significant implementation steps. So right now, we're at this point where both sides are signaling that they're interested in this third summit, but they both expect the other side to make the first move. And so my favorite analogy, it's actually Ambassador Joseph Hughes' analogy, but this is like high school dating where two sides are both kind of like, should I call first, should I call first? And so this is where President Moon of South Korea can play a huge role. I think he got what he needed from President Trump last week in terms of the sign of some flexibility. Those public comments all happened in that photo spray in the Oval Office before the 2-hour meeting. So I am hoping that there was actually more tangible discussions during the meeting, which he can now take back whether it's a phone call with Kim Jong-un or they decide to have another inter-Korean summit, sell him on the idea of flexibility. Hopefully, Kim Jong-un is flexible as well. And then we start with the working level discussions. The problem there is I feel like North Korea doesn't really respect Special Representative Began. They feel like Trump's the person to go talk to. And they're also very skeptical of Pompeo and Bolton. So what is the right level? If they're not going to really engage with Began at the Special Representative working level, it's too early to jump right into a third summit. It pretty much leaves that sort of ad hoc diplomacy where we'll hear in the news, oh, Pompeo is going to Pyongyang again, or Kim Young-chol is coming to DC again. I feel like that's probably the next step over the next couple months.
So you brought up President Moon and his meeting with Trump, and that he may have come away with some of the leverage that he needed to continue the conversation. And we shouldn't forget that alongside the U.S.-North Korea negotiations, we also have the inter-Korean process, and that it's made significant strides in reducing tensions between North Korea and South Korea. But I think there is some concern that the lack of progress on the U.S.-North Korean front could impede or slow down progress on the inter-Korean dialogue. So as Moon now starts to talk about another summit with Kim Jong-un, what should we be looking for in the inter-Korean process? How can the United States be supporting the inter-Korean process, and how might that relate to hopefully getting U.S.-North Korean negotiations back on track? So Suzanne, if we could start with you on that.
Well, I think first of all, I think there's some that look at this North-South Korea reconciliation process as a sideshow, and it isn't. It is in and of itself very important, and that's why I think concluding this peace declaration as soon as possible is so important. It's time to have a peace declaration. Now keep in mind that's different than a peace agreement, which would require intensive negotiations on a whole range of issues. But I do think we should be doing more to make sure that the process of peace and reconciliation between Seoul and Pyongyang continues. And it has been going at an impressive pace. Unlike the US and North Koreans, the South Koreans and North Koreans are meeting quite regularly. I think it's stopped a little bit. There's a bit of a lull now, which I think should worry us. But comparatively, since Singapore, North and South Korean officials have been meeting hundreds of times at various levels, high level but also working level. And I think we should recognize that progress for what it is. So in my mind, I think moving forward with the peace declaration in exchange for something like Yongbyon Plus would be a very good deal, particularly having, as I said, inspectors on the ground would really put it over the edge for me. And also moving forward on the sanctions. I think encouraging these economic joint projects to move forward would help solidify that peace process, that reconciliation process. So that's the way we should thinking. But my main point here is this is not a sideshow. There is something real happening on the Korean Peninsula. It is remarkable what is happening on the Korean Peninsula, and we really need to appreciate that and to make sure it continues to move forward and do everything we can to help move that along.
Frank, is there anything you'd like to add on the inter-Korean process?
Yeah, I think as Suzanne said, there's been a lot of progress on the inter-Korean side. The moving back of the guard post, the demining of the joint security area, the establishment of the Joint Military Committee. So there's a lot of good, the reduction of tensions, air, land, and sea around the demarcation line. But I think the concern is that the South Korean side is basically running out of road, meaning they've done a lot of what they can do, but at a certain point, they need the sanctions relief to do a little bit more. Sure, they can sort of institutionalize this joint military committee. They can work a little bit more on peace activities in the West Sea area, but there's not a whole lot more space to go until they start getting the sanctions relief. And so I feel like that's why South Korea is a very tough position. I think if we can get some sanctions relief measures on the joint Kaesong industrial complex, the Mount Kumgang tourism project, inter-Korean railway cooperation, that would be very hopeful for spurring U.S. DPRK diplomacy, but also inter-Korean engagement as well.
So you both have talked a little bit about options for getting the process back on track and what the United States and North Korea could do to be more flexible to advance an agreement. But there's still a great deal of skepticism here in Washington about whether or not Kim Jong-un is actually sincere about negotiations. And there's talk, both in the administration and in parts of Congress, that now is actually the time to be putting additional pressure on North Korea, that if we slap additional sanctions on, then we can try and sort of force them back to the table. So, Frank, what is your opinion on this? Is this the time for additional sanctions? And given that this is kind of coming particularly from Congress right now, what would you be telling Congress that an appropriate role for them is within this diplomatic process?
Now is not the time for new sanctions. Now, I want to clarify. Well, so first of all, I would say that new significant sanctions will completely scuttle diplomacy, and then we're back to 2017 or very close to, I think. Yeah. I will say that there's a difference between new sanctions legislation or UN Security Council resolutions and stronger enforcement of current sanctions, which I think, depending on what exactly we're talking about, could be helpful. I know that Treasury probably has a huge tranche of additional designations that they want to make on third-party entities. That may be okay in sort of creating additional pressure, but I think right now we need to let diplomacy work. There's not much time anyways, and so I think if we get to next year and nothing has happened, then I think you'll start to see the administration moving forward with additional tranches of designations, as well as Congress moving forward with, there's the LEAD Act, the BRINC Act, additional ways to really tighten down in North Korea, and we'll start seeing those move forward.
Suzanne?
I just want to add something about Congress. I have the opportunities to meet with representatives of Congress and their staff, also on the Senate side, and sometimes I'm just appalled, frankly, by how anti-diplomacy they are on this issue for different reasons. Some are against it because how can you trust someone like Kim Jong-un? We've been down this road before. It's very self-defeating. But others are, we can't hand a win to Trump. I think both sides are equally asinine, if I can say so. And I think in this regard, yes, there's reason to be skeptical. We don't know what Kim Jong-un, his level of seriousness. That's what diplomacy is for, is to test it. And we need to continually test it, but also, that's why I'm supportive of the step-by-step approach, because it is a way to test it. They do something, we do something. I mean, this is very basic, fundamental, but it's a way, if we're really going to change the contentious nature of our relationship between Washington and Pyongyang, we have to start somewhere. And I think this is a process, given the mutual distrust that exists and all the psychological baggage over decades of failed negotiations, we have to try it. So I think for Congress, they need to put aside both those reasons and support the process of diplomacy. And yes, Congress should be in a position of oversight. I think the first 2 years of this administration, there's been no oversight on this process since it started. So that needs to be changed. So oversight, but not an obstacle to diplomacy. And one of the things I think we need more of are hearings, bringing in experts to testify on a range of issues of importance to this negotiation, and also getting Pompeo to be there to give regular updates to the Congress on what's happening. I think a lot of us have been in the dark, and there needs to be a bit more transparency to the extent that it doesn't derail the process, I should say.
So sometimes these additional calls for sanctions, the calls for additional pressure, are in response to North Korean statements or North Korean events. And since the Hanoi summit, we saw Madam Choi say North Korea may return to testing, if the dialogue doesn't continue. Satellite imagery has suggested that North Korea is reconstituting some of the Sohae satellite launch site. So when North Korea is taking these actions that may seem kind of counter to diplomacy, how would you advise kind of both the administration and Congress to react to those types of actions? Suzanne, would you like to start?
Oh, can you just sum it up again? I thought it was for
Frank can start, and then.
Yeah, so I think that is the concern, because today, April 15, is actually today is the anniversary of Kim Il-sung's birthday, and so this is when people were thinking, oh, this might be a time where North Korea might conduct some provocative action. So, but I think the administration is taking the right approach, that they are closely watching the situation, they're monitoring to see what will happen, and they are warning against any missile tests or satellite launches, because that would be very destabilizing for the current diplomatic process. If a satellite launch does occur, then I think President Trump has a very hard decision to make, because on one hand, while a satellite launch is prohibited by international law, it's not so provocative of action that it should derail diplomacy. On the other hand, if you just accept it and continue along the path, then maybe you're sort of accepting North Korea's brinkmanship behavior. So fortunately, nothing has happened today. I hope it doesn't, but it'd be a tough situation if something does happen.
Well, I checked Twitter right before I came up here, and there didn't seem to be anything yet, so fingers crossed. But
so on this point, this is another reason why the North Koreans and Americans should be having regular meetings, because then we could talk about the fact that they shouldn't be launching a satellite that derailed diplomacy before in the past, the Leap Day agreement, and we'd hate to see that happen again. But on the point of what Kim Jong-un is thinking in terms of whether or not he'll test, at this point, I don't think so, because President Trump has been very clear on this point, and I'm going to use the word Admiral Mullins just said he hated, in terms of a red line. He made it very clear that testing is his red line, and I think he is serious about that. So I don't think at this point the North Koreans would risk blowing negotiations out of the water by pushing that issue. And getting to Kim Jong-un, in terms of one of the things that has really fascinated me about this whole process and his whole coming out party on the world stage is how much he and those around him in the ruling class have communicated to the people of North Korea that they have a new strategic line, and it is economic development. It's not just us in the international audience that are hearing this, or in the elites. This is being broadcast on the news. It's in billboards, from what I can see, around Pyongyang. So I think it is, I don't want to say transparent, because I think that's going too far, but I think in a way it is Kim Jong-un putting himself out there that this is their strategic goal right now, is to shift the focus of the country to economic development and modernization. So in a way, he has staked his legitimacy on fulfilling that, just the same way he fulfilled Byung-chul and the nuclear program advancing to this point. So that's been fascinating to watch, and I think we should take it very seriously. And take it seriously, but also pursue it seriously, because that gives us leverage. If indeed he is staking his credibility on economic development, then we have a lot of leverage.
Well, and it certainly helps signal what North Korea is looking for and prioritizing. So I'm going to turn it over to audience questions in just a minute, but first, we have to remember also that negotiations with North Korea are not happening in a vacuum. And as Daryl mentioned, I work on Iran. I know Suzanne does also, and we haven't talked much about Iran, so I have to squeeze this in just a little bit. The current controversy over the nuclear deal with Iran, the uncertain future after the United States withdrew from that deal, do you see that at all as impacting North Korea's thinking about how they're approaching these negotiations, and has that impacted U.S. credibility in these talks?
There's no question in my mind that the North Koreans are thinking about this. They've been studying it. First, they studied how the negotiations happened to get to the deal, And now they've been studying how it has disintegrated with the withdrawal of the U.S. It's still in place, but it's a different situation now that we're out of the deal. Let me focus on two ways that I think the North Koreans have learned a terrible lesson from the U.S. reneging on its commitments to the Iran nuclear deal. First is, at the very heart of the nuclear deal with Iran was a very basic bargain. You do this, and we lift sanctions. And now, the Iranians, I think the IAEA has confirmed for the 14th consecutive time, or is it 15 now?
I'm losing count
Somewhere,
too.
I know, we're starting to lose count, that the Iranians are complying with their commitments to this deal. So it sends the signal to the North Koreans that even if you comply with your what you've agreed to do, we still may not lift these sanctions. You may not get the benefits that we agreed to. That's a terrible message to be sending, especially to a country where, the Iranians never had a nuclear weapons, a single nuclear weapon, but especially to a country where they do. It provides very little incentive to move forward. And the second area, there are many, many areas. I've thought about this long and hard, but I'll limit it to one more. And that is the issue of irreversibility. And I think getting to your point, Kelsey, about the earlier question, I think one of the reasons after Hanoi, the North Koreans put back up the missile site that they had already decommissioned was to show us that nothing they have done yet is irreversible. And unlike the Iranians, who poured concrete into their plutonium facility in Arak, not quite irreversible, but pretty darn close, for the Iranians to come back on a plutonium path, it would probably cost millions, but also take years, an estimated 5 years to bring that back up. That's pretty irreversible, and I think the North Koreans have seen what the Iranians have done to their program, and here they are now, stuck. And I don't think the North Koreans want to do that. So getting back to my earlier point, I really firmly believe North Koreans are not going to do anything significant, certainly nothing close to irreversible, before they feel the regime is safe and that there's a clear path to economic development and modernization.
Great. Questions from the floor? Yes, this woman here in the center. Oh, if you could wait for the mic, please.
Thank you. My name's Connie. I'm a reporter for Voice of America. I just want to touch upon North Korea's People's Supreme Assembly that we briefly mentioned in the beginning. One of the key messages from Kim Jong-un was his push to change the U.S.'s political calculations, such as the U.S.'s position on sanctions and the denuclearization process. How do you think this stance from North Korea is going to affect the negotiations? And also, how do you assess President Moon's role as a mediator based on Kim Jong-un's speech at the Supreme People's Assembly? Great.
So when North Korea talks about the hostile U.S. policy, they're always kind of vague about it. What does that mean, hostile U.S. policy? Well, it runs across the diplomatic, economic, military spheres. So all of the exercises, the nuclear strategic and strategic assets on the peninsula, the lack of normalized relations. But on the economic side, a hostile U.S. policy is the sanctions. So that is North Korea's goal, to break that sanctions regime and the overall global pressure campaign that the U.S. has been implementing. Kim Jong-un has doubled down on that. I think what President Moon can do is basically try to offer suggestions for ways that both sides can be flexible. One idea that came out again suggested in the press conference remarks that Vice Foreign Minister Che Sun-hee made was the possibility of the snackback provisions, right, what we saw in Iran. So I feel like we have this divergent gap between the approaches of both sides. Big comprehensive deal up front on one hand. For North Korea, it's incremental, step-by-step reciprocal action. So how do you converge those two policies? Again, one idea might be trying to agree to a comprehensive deal on paper, but then have the implementation process be more step-by-step. and then also including the snapback provisions.
And even if they agreed to the big deal, you would need a process in place. It's not, we can't snap our fingers and it's going to happen overnight. So I agree with you on that.
Great. Des, there in the back.
Catherine Killow, Plowshares Fund. I'm very curious about the recent developments in North Korea with the leadership reshuffling, and specifically, as some experts have noted, it's interesting that several foreign ministry officials have been elevated in a way we haven't seen under Kim Jong-il. So could you speak to what that means, if anything? Is that a signal to the US? How should we be reading it? And what does it mean for future negotiations with Madame Che in an elevated position? Thanks.
I think many people were surprised. I think it was 3 foreign ministry officials who were involved and received very substantial promotions. I think the conventional wisdom had been that the foreign ministry, I think the conventional wisdom has been that the foreign ministry had been sidelined and the Kim Young-chol was taking the lead. And I even think that the United States government itself has been waiting and hoping that this portfolio for taking the lead on the negotiations would shift from Kim Young-chol to the foreign ministry. I mean, at the end of the day, we really don't know what these changes mean, but I do think that the North Koreans may be readying to move the portfolio more towards the foreign ministry as negotiations, if they get off the ground. I think that might be a sign that they're ready to do that. But it's so opaque, we really don't know what any of these changes mean. This is a lot of tea leaf reading.
Frank, did you want to add anything on that? Or? Okay, great. We'll take this question here in front.
Galen Carey with the National Association of Evangelicals. So this is an arms control meeting, so I think everyone here would be thrilled if the nuclear threat were to be taken off the table in the Korean Peninsula. But what about the human rights of the North Korean people? Is there any indication that if sanctions are lifted that would actually lead to concrete improvements for North Koreans? And if not, what else could be done about that?
Well, I don't think there's any indication that just because you lift sanctions, all of a sudden the human rights situation improves. I think the administration, and this is sort of a fine line it has to tread here, but it has to make human rights a part of the negotiations for it to be something that's negotiated. I'm a little torn on this one because on one hand, there are, human rights plays an important role in the security process, including for example, human rights violations with forced labor abroad, and that continues to fund North Korea's WMD program. So there is a linkage between those two issues. What I will say is that we need to be creative about thinking about how human rights can be helpful in this process. So one idea that I always sort of turn to is thinking about the Helsinki process. And basically, we had a situation where we were giving the Soviet bloc exactly what it wanted in terms of, a security conference, economic cooperation, and in return, we have to put in that human rights basket, right? And so I think if we can think about something similar to that, where we make it a comprehensive deal, raise the human rights issue. It doesn't have to be where it's so provocative, where we're talking about Kim Jong-un being tried before the ICJ, but really just elevating the human rights concerns. There's probably a way to introduce that might be helpful to the discussion.
Yeah, I think I was very dismayed when I heard that during the Singapore summit, the U.S. team did not raise human rights at all. I understand that in order to get negotiations going, and we've made denuclearization our top priority, we cannot add human rights as a negotiating item at this stage. But I think at the very least, American officials meeting with North Koreans need to raise these issues in an aspirational way, not in a demanding way, in an aspirational way. So I'm hoping that that happened in Hanoi. The other thing is we have to, our own credibility. Here we are, the U.S. had disallowed humanitarian NGOs from entering North Korea to do very important work on food security, health, etc. And I think that that was a big mistake. And I think the administration is slowly coming around to realize that, and now they're letting a few humanitarian NGOs back in to do this work. I think in order for us to be able to sit down and talk to the North Koreans about human rights with credibility, we need to be able to say that we are permitting these organizations to do this important work, because after all, it affects the North Korean people, and that's really what we want to reach. I feel very strongly about that. We should let the humanitarian NGOs back in.
Mark, there in the back.
Thanks very much.
Oh,
I got the mic.
Yeah.
This is a great panel. Suzanne, I would agree that a declaration ending the war is sort of an easy card that the United States could play in. I'm not sure exactly what it would be at Yongbyon, whether closing all of it or allowing in inspections. Last August, I thought that the North Koreans placed more emphasis on that. Today, they're talking more about sanctions relief. Frank stressed the importance of implementing sanctions. You suggested one step-by-step would be to allow inter-Korean cooperation. My question is there a way to allow such relaxation of the South North Korean sanctions that doesn't pull the plug from implementing sanctions elsewhere? Wouldn't it, I'm afraid it might give other countries a signal that they can take their foot off the gas, or maybe China and Russia already have, I guess.
Great question, thank you. I'm not a sanctions expert, so I'm going to tread carefully here. But my understanding is for some of the activity to be allowed to move forward, it wouldn't require a full lifting of these sanctions. It could be done through exemptions, and also could be done through special mechanisms that are set up to facilitate activity like Kaesong and so forth. I think, where there's a will, there's a way, and we can think creatively on how to get this done without throwing out all of the sanctions at once. And again, our goal is to use sanctions how they're meant to change behavior, to move things forward, and we really need to be able to do this. I feel we, the United States, have become so dependent on sanctions as a weapon of foreign policy to punish and to fault. And yes, there's an element of that has to happen. But here we are at the cusp of a breakthrough, and I don't think we should be so unwilling to use sanctions how they ideally are meant to be used. And in terms of the peace agreement, I think you're absolutely right. In my discussions with the North Koreans dating back to 2016 and even 2017, they put the peace agreement at the top of their list as a priority of what they wanted to have in exchange. That boat has sailed. There's no question about it. These days, I remember meeting with North Koreans a year ago, and they didn't even bring up the peace declaration. I had to bring it up in our conversations. You're right, it's sanctions now. It's all about the sanctions. And I also think changing the nature of the relationship that I talked about earlier.
Yeah, I'll just add really quickly that I'm not a sanctions expert either, but yeah, there are waivers of sanctions or permissions given by the 1718 Sanctions Committee that would allow for ways to get around the prohibition on bulk cash transfers and joint economic commercial ventures. That doesn't dismantle the entire regime or that specific resolution, but provides that one-off waiver. And I agree with Suzanne as well. In my discussions with North Korean officials in track 1.5 dialogues, they've they've moved off of the end of war declaration. What they've said to me is basically that, we thought it'd be sort of a nice, thing for the U.S. to do, but the U.S. side seems to be hemming and hawing on it, which it was because it was probably introduced around the summer of last year, and for about 3-4 months, there was a lot of discussion about what that means. The U.S. side was getting confused. What's the difference between an end of war declaration and a peace agreement? The Defense Department was concerned about what that means for our security architecture in the region. And at that point, North Korea's like, well, if the U.S. side doesn't want it, then we don't want it either. What's the point here?
But I still think we should move forward because it's important to the Korean people on both sides of the divide. And I think that means something.
We have time for one last question. The gentleman here at the middle table.
Thank you, and thank you for this discussion. Someone once said, personnel makes policy, and my question, my comment, I guess, is the National Security Advisor opposed the Iran deal. He opposed the Libya deal. He's opposed virtually every arms control agreement that's ever come down the pike. He opposed the Greek framework. So I don't think there's too much reason for optimism about where we might go in the future, the United States might go, during this administration anyhow. Quick question regarding the peace treaty, if I could. Historically, autocrats have oftentimes used the external enemy as the justification for their power. If you did that in North Korea, if you had a peace treaty with North Korea, what do you think Kim would have as his justification to remain in power? Thank you.
So in terms of a peace treaty, I think one of the important elements to Kim would be security guarantees, and perhaps even a full normalization of relations with us. And in terms of the security guarantees, that of course would have to include the regional players, especially Beijing, would have to be a big part of that conversation. And getting to your point about the National Security Advisor, he who shall not be named, I've tweeted about this and I've been very clear that I'm confused. If Trump is a deal maker, he wants to make deals, he wants to reach diplomatic agreements, why does he have this person on his team? You said he was against the agreed framework. It was more than that. To use his own words, he was the hammer that smashed the agreed framework. So let me just make one more point that might be a little pushing it hard. But when I looked at the photos from Hanoi, I was very confused. On the North Korean side, I saw seasoned diplomats, some of whom have been working this file for decades. And on our side, I have to be frank, I didn't see a single diplomat, I didn't see a single negotiator. I'm going to be a little harsh. I don't think President Trump is a negotiator. He's a brander. Secretary Pompeo is not a negotiator. He's a politician. Nick Mulvaney, I don't really know much about him, so I can't say. But I don't think has experience negotiating on these issues. And then finally, he who shall not be named is not a negotiator that builds agreements. He is an official who tears down agreements. So I think you've put your finger on a very big program. Personnel needs to be changed.
So I think you made an excellent point. North Korea certainly speaks to its domestic audience, and I've heard both arguments. So on one hand, North Korea needs to continue the war footing, and in order to do that, it needs that external enemy, right? So if you have a peace treaty, then how do you maintain the legitimacy of the regime when there's peace, right? On the other hand, I've also heard the argument that there are various constituencies within the North Korean regime, and Kim Jong-un needs to make this argument to them to convince them that their security is assured, and one way is through a peace treaty. We've seen the harsh rhetoric against the U.S. Diminish in North Korea over the last year or so. We've had President Moon go to Pyongyang, speak before 150,000 North Koreans in the Mayday Stadium and talk about denuclearization. That is an incredible shift, I think, just in the last year and a half. So I think what we can do is test that hypothesis and see where that process leads us.
So unfortunately, that's all the time we have today for the panel. Needless to say, I would feel much more comfortable if Suzanne and Frank were leading the U.S. delegation in negotiations with North Korea.
You, Kelsey.
But, oh, okay. But we appreciate all of the ideas that you've put out about the process moving forward, what more flexibility looks like on both sides, the actual role that sanctions should play in the negotiations, and your comments on the role of Congress. I think it was a very rich discussion. I appreciate that, and please join me in thanking our panel.